Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth episode of the Just in Discussion series. Thank you for once again for joining us. And this will be the end of the year review and recap, actually, of things that have been happening in 2020. And joining us today would actually be Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, President of the International Movement for a Just World, who we will be going through a series of reviews about the major events that have been happening throughout the year. Of course, among the most notable things has to be the COVID 2020 pandemic and many other various things in geopolitical related issues. And more prominently also is the aftermath of the U.S. presidential elections. So in this part, I will be passing the camera to Dr. Chandra and we'll be going through our discussions. Okay, Dr. Chandra. Hi, Dr. Chandra. Okay, thank you for joining us today. And I think I'll begin the first series of questions actually based on, I want to get your insights on what's been happening around this year in particular. As you know, we've experienced one of the biggest pandemic hits of our time, and also one of the greatest shift in political histories of our time, I suppose, on a geopolitical level. But in regards to, I want to get your insights about what you think on the matter, because in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's showcased a lot of things that has happened in our society, especially how it affected the vulnerable peoples, how it has affected all our daily life, and it, in a sense, caused a great upheaval towards social order. What do you think the lessons that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us?
Well, thank you, Asana, and I should begin by commending you for initiating this series of discussions. Since it's the end of the year, I think it is perhaps appropriate that we reflect on what has happened in the course of the year. And you're right in highlighting the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, and its impact on the world. Of course, there are one or two other events which we also allude to after we have dealt with this. I would like to approach the pandemic from three angles, actually. Number one, it is not out of the ordinary. It has happened before.
Mm-hmm.
We know that about 100 years ago, there was what was wrongly labeled the Spanish flu,
Mm-hmm.
because, it was not confined to Spain, nor was it caused by the Spaniards, but there was, it was called the Spanish flu.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a massive impact upon the human family at that time. Mind you, technology was at a lower level,
Mm-hmm.
and communications were more limited, but nonetheless, it was a major event, And now we have this pandemic, and don't forget that even within this cluster of epidemics, we've also had SARS 1 and 2, and we've had Ebola.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's not as if it is something that is totally new.
Mm-hmm.
We've had episodes of this sort. We must first keep that in mind, because that's one way of ensuring that we have the right focus, that it is something that has been part of our experience of our generation, and for perhaps a few other generations to come, because there is this prediction that we'll have more epidemics of this sort in the future, and the epidemics of the future could be even more severe than what we've experienced this time. So it's something that we should see as part of the new normal, if you like, the reality which confronts all of us. That's the first point one would like to make about the pandemic. Now, in terms of its significance, though it is something that has happened, will happen again in the future, there is, I think, a certain significance to what we have witnessed since December 2019, January 2020, for almost a year now. Let me very quickly look at its special significance, this particular epidemic here. It is significant in the sense that, unlike what has happened before, it's much more widespread in terms of its reach. It's really amazing how almost every country in the world has been affected by this pandemic. In terms of its severity, it is also perhaps more severe than what we have known in the recent past, including maybe SARS and so on, which were very severe. And it is also significant in the sense that its impact upon the economy, upon society as a whole, is much more devastating. And maybe that is its most significant dimension, much more devastating. We know from our experience with the SARS and with Ebola and so on that, of course, groups of people are affected, economies are affected, but look at what's happening now. The global economy itself has been brought to a grinding halt. And that is what makes it so unique. Nearly every economy, big and small, north, south, east, west, they have been torpedoed by this epidemic, And that, I think, is something which is out of the ordinary, and we have to reflect on that, its impact on jobs, on social mobility, on economic activities, small, medium-sized industries, huge corporations, everyone. And we are not even sure whether we'll be able to get out of this.
So, Dr. Chandra, because I heard a lot of this term being bounced around as well on the internet, where people have actually called this COVID pandemic, it's part of a conspiracy theories groups that have actually been pushing it around. A lot of people have been calling it something of a great reset that's being pushed around by the corporation, because the funny thing is, I think maybe I can get your insight on this, because some people have said that yes, we have experience with the SARS, the Spanish flu, so we should be theoretically more able and well prepared. So do you think is there some link to the pandemic and the agendas of the powerful when it comes to how they actually try to manage the pandemic in terms of a great global reset, as some have actually tried to persist?
Well, this theory about reset has been put forward by some individuals who think that something out of the ordinary is happening, that there are people manipulating the situation and so on for a nefarious agenda or an ulterior purpose. I've tried to understand this from that perspective. I'm trying to see if it is possible that something else is happening. I ask a couple of questions, and I'm not convinced that this is part of something that's conscious, an attempt to reset the entire global economy to benefit certain vested interests and so on. Why do I say that? Number one, I look at the individuals and groups that have been named by those who believe in this theory. I mean, there's of course the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, and people have named Bill Gates and others who are also apparently pushing this. Now and then the name George Soros also comes up and so on. But they may be involved in some aspect or other of this pandemic. Like, it's a fact that Bill Gates, his foundation, sponsored the sort of simulation exercise that they held sometime in 2019 to see how a global epidemic caused by a virus would impact upon the world and all the rest of it. But beyond that, I don't think anyone has been able to show how each and every aspect of this crisis would benefit the Bill Melinda Foundation or how it would benefit the type of economic order that they have in mind, because the sort of economic order that they have in mind is also not very clear. But if we are talking about their role as far as epidemics are concerned, yes, it's true that their foundation has been active in trying to eradicate polio in some parts of the world, that they have been involved in providing basic sanitation facilities in parts of Africa. They've supported efforts in India. They've done things of that sort, But to link all that with what is happening and, to see this as something that is really malicious, something which is really well planned, a sort of evil that is unfolding, as argued by certain individuals, I'm not so sure. I'm not convinced. So this is why, in terms of the Western interests associated with this, allegedly associated with this, now they're going to benefit is not very clear. And the other reason why I have doubts about this theory, if one looks at conspiracy theories, and if you look at attempts to reset a certain pattern, I mean, let's say that after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the bipolar world, there was an attempt to foist a unipolar world upon humankind. It is very clear who the actors were. If it is true that there was this conscious plan, it's very clear how they would benefit from a unipolar world and what the consequences would be and so on. I don't see anything of that sort as far as this pandemic is concerned, that I don't see it in terms of a certain pattern emerging associated with new economic powers or new forces, because somehow it must come from the existing landscape. If it is to impact upon all of us, and if it is going to change the world, it must come from that landscape. But I don't see any group in the landscape, because if you're talking about, say, China benefiting the thing, I mean, China also paid the price. If you're talking about Russia, Russia is number 3 in terms of most affected countries, and of course, the United States, we know how it is affected. And if you look at certain interests and so on, I don't think it is possible to pin it down to any of these phenomena. So I'm a little reluctant for reasons like this. When I look at the existing landscape, the emerging forces, the economic changes that may occur as a result of this epidemic, and the whole question of who is benefiting, which interest does it's not that clear. Maybe there is something to be said for these theories, perhaps, I don't know. But I would hesitate to draw rigid conclusions from what is happening. What I see is, yes, there is an epidemic that has broken out, that's real, that COVID-19 is real, that there are victims, and the impact has been disastrous upon economies and upon socio-political patterns and so on. All that is true. Yeah, and that's obvious, to many of us. But underlying motives, manipulators, those who are going to benefit from this, and what sort of new economic order is being planned and all that, those things are not that clear. So it is just a situation, a given situation that has emerged, and that is clear to us. But even how it emerged is still not very clear. There's no consensus on what caused this epidemic to spread in this manner. We know the cause; it's connected with virus, and whether it is from the natural world, the animal kingdom that moved on to the human world, and or it is something that was created in a laboratory and then transmitted to various parts of the world. These are different theories about what had really happened, how this whole thing had emerged. I hope the WHO investigation, they're supposed to look into this whole thing, and with the cooperation of the Chinese government, it's happening right now that they are exploring this to see what was the cause. The Chinese government, so far, according to the WHO, has cooperated with them, and they would want to look at, for instance, the initial cases, the symptoms, and whether there is a certain pattern and all the rest of it. We hope that it will be able to enlighten us.
So that's the thing as well, because at the end of the day, a lot of the narrative that we mentioned just now, especially when it comes to the great economy reset about actually who's driving these things, yes, it's true. A lot of these countries don't benefit from the virus itself. But then I see a lot of it tends to actually be coming from the Western American blocs that are mentioning this. And I think it actually relates to the next topic that I'm segueing into, which is the American presidential election. Because one can argue that that the virus itself took a very big hit on Trump's previously potential prospect for his presidency. And one could say that his presidency ended because the virus, essentially the pandemic, and how his administration had handled it, had ended actually, handled the virus, and essentially ended because of it. So in that sense, a lot of people have been going around saying that this virus is a great reset, a bunch of conspirators from his opponents and all that sort of thing. So that's a lot of where the narrative is being driven from, actually. But the question then comes actually more on now, when it comes to global geopolitics, we've seen how the virus has already grinded the world essentially to a halt. It's driven the American presidential election to one direction. Never mind about how geopolitical relations have been essentially stagnated to an extent for a lot of things, except for here and there. But with regards to the presidential election of China, because it is the next biggest thing that happened in the 2020. What do you think of what's happened? How do you reflect on Trump's administration during his 4 years, and not only just how he's done, but the fiasco of the election itself? And what do you see that the Biden administration, where is it going to go from there?
Well, before one deals with this question, because I think it is a very important question and it's going to take us in another direction, I thought one should also add very quickly in relation to the earlier part of our discussion that those of us who are hoping that a pandemic of this sort would at least bring about some changes in the value system of civilization as a whole, in some of the structures of power, in the way in which we relate to one another and so on. That's fundamental. We are hoping that some change of that sort will take place, that this is a sort of an opportunity. We don't want to say it's a plan or it is an agenda pursued by someone. It was an opportunity for some of us. We thought this was an opportunity to bring about a transformation. a much needed transformation for the entire human family, which had perhaps, in the opinion of some of these individuals, I include myself, as an individual, within that array of human beings who are concerned about, the state of the globe and what is happening to the human family. We're hoping that we would begin to rethink, and not only just rethink, but act consciously as a group and work towards something different. But that has not happened. And I don't see how it can happen, though at one time one was a little more optimistic. I'm very doubtful if that's going to happen. So setting that aside, what I think is more tangible, if one wants to talk about some conspiracy, then maybe the one that comes closest in terms of actual events and how they've unfolded and what the consequences are. I think one could, if one is going to be mischievous about the whole thing, say that maybe the deep state planned the whole thing. Yes, to overthrow Trump because he had become a nuisance, a menace to the deep state, meaning by which to the U.S. global agenda. And there was no other way in which they could defeat him. Because, as you alluded to, from readings put forward by different people, his standing was very good just before this thing happened. Because of the economy, it was humming along well, and it's true that in terms of creating jobs, even if you look at groups who he may have despised, he had created jobs for elements within those groups, the Hispanics, and the, African Americans, and so on. And there were people who thought, well, this guy has done quite well, and if he goes to the polls on the basis of this record, he's going to win. And the only thing that would defeat him was something like this. So maybe someone had created this whole thing and driven it in a particular direction. Like what Trump himself said. And of course, he's not the best source that we should quote, but he had said that, you see, the moment the presidential election is over, you'll find that they will discover the vaccine.
It was kind of right, funny enough about it. So one couldn't help but verify his claims a little bit. It sort of validates it, but even then, also it's just how it's so strange.
And of course, what it means actually is that there is this horrendous part about it. That if it was planned by the deep state, and the deep state has done all sorts of things, there is no evil that it's not capable of. You look at its history, the deep state. Well, did the deep state then plan the massacre of his own people? 200 over 1,000, people, become victims, and the sufferings. If you look at it globally, it is just unbelievable. I mean, but it's not just people outside the borders of the United States, within the United States. So many, hundreds of thousands had died. So did the deep state do all that? And killing Iraqis is one thing.
But some people.
But yes, on such a massive scale, and did it? One is very doubtful if that would have happened. But on the other hand, if you look at the history of the United States, as it has been pointed out by various people, including someone like Cornel West, what is its history? It's a history of genocide. And that's against the indigenous native population, history of well, basically racism against the African American population and so on. So that's its history. It's a terrible history. It's a history that one should be ashamed of. So it's not inconceivable that something like this
they would kill their own people.
I will not advocate this theory, until I see much more tangible evidence to support this, to convince all of us that the dots can be connected in a particular way. going to remain a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Because for Trump itself, it's true as well what you said. His popularity, even arguably during the election itself, was in half actually. He pretty much divided America straight right down the line right there.
Certainly.
So it's amazing, but it also indicates to me that there's a paradigm shift going on in America that is still continuing to evolve until this day. But it's also affected the rest of the world. And it seems that a lot of them right now, even with the Biden administration coming in, they're actually just trying to not just really just undo a lot of what he's done, but it's seen as more of a way of the deep state, as you mentioned, to try and take control back of what they thought they lost under the Trump administration, which is the reins of power. But in that sense of the Chandra, looking forward now to the current administration, how it's going to affect geopolitics? Because right now, China is the issue, Iran is the issue. There's a lot of moves going on again right now. And this whole normalization of Israel is also the biggest topics as well. So I suppose because we have a few more minutes left, I would like to ask you on a final note as well on looking forward, what are we to expect in the future? But more importantly than that, how can we try to address and what are the ways that we can do to engage and deal with the coming situations?
Yeah. Well, one thing that one can be certain about, compared to the Trump administration 4 years, Joe Biden will most likely return the United States of America to the role it has played for decades after the Second World War, but even before the Second World War. But basically, it is the role of the nation that sees itself as the leader of the world. It has got a right, a sort of perhaps even divine right, according to some people, to rule the world and to set the agenda for the rest of humankind. Its attempt to forge ties with others and to work with them and so on, it may all be part of that camouflage. In other words, pretend to be multilateral when actually the intention is unilateral. It is basically the U.S. and its own agenda, like what it did in the case of the Iraq War, and the later invasion and occupation of Iraq and so on. There was a pretense of working with others. So they may do that. And even in the terms of the Paris Agreement and so on, it will be basically what the United States wants, like the TPP that didn't take off, but it was their example of multilateralism. But what were they trying to do? Pretend to bring others together, but basically it was driven by the US vision of its own future. Global trade should be, all the rest of it. So I wouldn't be surprised if Biden basically returns to that sort of agenda. And in the case of the West Asia, for instance, he would remain loyal to Israeli interests. Those things are not going to change. He's not going to bring back the earlier protocol when it came to the question of Jerusalem as the headquarters of the SS, the capital that would play this particular role, where they would have the embassy and it would be the capital of the state of Israel, recognized by the world and so on. And even this push normalization, I don't think one should see it just as a Trump agenda, though the Trump agenda played a role in shaping that. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and all the rest of it. Netanyahu, he wanted that sort of thing. I would see it as also part of the deep state's agenda. So this is one instance where the deep state, its interests coincided with that of Trump. So in the question of West Asia and interests of that sort, it is clear. It's going to be the same sort of in a pattern, maybe even worse. We don't know, yeah. But multilateralism as a sort of camouflage, yes. But essentially, the U.S. and quite a lot of people, even in the global south, would love this. They would want to reassert their power. And people would feel comfortable with that. The US, once again, reasserting its power, that the world is going to be more stable, because their reading would be whatever it is, this man Trump was unpredictable. And for that reason, he was a headache to the deep state. And for all those other leaders in other countries, it became a big question mark, how to deal with this guy. But so a certain degree of predictability within the existing pattern, and U.S. again, trying to reassert its power. But in a world that has changed, and even if you look at what has happened in the last, 15 or 20 years, it is obvious that things have been changing in a particular direction. China, not just economic power, as a scientific power, and Russia's reassertion of military power. Iran, Turkey, changing the landscape in the whole of West Asia. I mean, you can see the role that Russia has also played in that part of the world, including, how they resolved the Armenia, Azerbaijan dispute, or trying to resolve the dispute. So I think things are changing. The US will not be able to set the agenda like it attempted to in the past. It succeeded to a great extent, but I think things have changed.
Yeah. So one could say that the US is trying to reset the status quo in a world that's moved on from it already.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Chandra. I think our time is up actually. But on that note, would you like to give any last message to how what we should look forward to in the future and how we should approach it?
Yeah. Well, very quickly, given our time constraint, Sana, I would say that there are perhaps two very important things we must all keep in mind. Hegemony is still our major challenge, and it's going to express itself in different ways, but we have to continue to be vigilant. To oppose hegemony, it would have to be not just at the level of governments, because I don't think that's going to be an important factor. It's more at the level of people's organizations, individual citizen groups, and so on. They have to stand up against hegemony. And the prospects of effective resistance, the prospects are there, given the way things have changed. You can see that people's groups have become more vocal, and even if you look at this US election, there were groups that were asking some searching questions about the US's role in global affairs, much more than in the past, though they didn't have an impact overall because, Biden is not being of different, sort of thing. We know that, but nonetheless, they did speak up and they were equally critical of Biden and all the rest of it. So that's the point I'm making. Number one, that we must continue to remain as vigilant as ever against hegemony. It is going to take new forms and be more desperate in some ways, because the hegemon who is on its way down is perhaps more dangerous than the hegemon at the pinnacle of power. And they're going to be quite ruthless. And the second thing that we must keep in mind is that I think those of us who want a different sort of world, and that's where I think the pandemic comes in, it has compelled us to rethink relationships, structures of power, patterns for the future. And I think that effort has to continue. It has to continue, and it should be something which is realistic. It should be based upon the forces that are shaping our landscape. In other words, we're not talking about a utopian approach. It should be something that is realistic. But nonetheless, I think that sort of thinking has to develop further. And within that framework, as shown by the virus, I don't think one can ignore interconnectedness because the virus itself and its impact is a product of that interconnectedness.
That's right.
We cannot ignore interconnectedness, and we cannot ignore the whole question of the spiritual, moral basis of human existence, because that is the ultimate question. Why are we here, and what are we doing here, and
how we treat each other.
That's right. So it is very, very important, to raise those questions as part of the role that we all have to play as trustees of the transcendent, of the divine. And I would even argue that there are changes taking place within religion as conventionally understood that are, in a sense, forcing us to look more deeply, to dive deeply into this whole phenomenon and bring out these dimensions to the fore. This may sound odd to some people, but I think the sort of crisis related to religions that we are witnessing everywhere, in the case of South Asia, India, in particular Hindutva, a sort of perversion of Hinduism. And if you look at what is happening to Christianity, the Christian right, the way it is, what's happening to even Buddhism, look at Myanmar.
Yes, that's right.
If you look at Judaism and the way it has been undermined, its universalism, its message of compassion, undermined by the Israeli state, in a sense. And if you look at Islam, the way it has been undermined by elements who seem to hug the headlines, but they have a distorted, perverted view of the religion itself. They don't want to look at its real, message, its core message. So they seem to be taken up more by, things which are perhaps important in one sense, the rituals, the forms, and so on, which are part of any religious ideology. But they are not capable of understanding even those rituals in terms of its essential message. And that, I think, is a very big problem, and Muslims as a whole have to wake up to that. So every religion, I think, is in a crisis in terms of its actual practice. And that crisis has been brought about by all these other forces that we have talked about.
And ultimately, I also think that it is informed on how we react to these other forces and react to, like the COVID pandemic. It has also challenged our notion of compassion, of religiosity, and of empathy towards each other. And I think that's the amazing thing about this whole thing. At the end of the day, thank you very much, Dr. Chandra, because this is a wonderful reflection on how we should understand ourselves as human beings and ourselves in nature, but also in regards to our place in the universe, in the sense, because at the end of the day, we really need to reflect on this and understand where we're going with this part, and but also plan on which principles that we need to hold on to. So, okay, Dr. Chandra, but I think that's a lot to also reflect on, and ultimately there'll be a lot more, I'm sure, in the future that we will be discussing on. So, this is the last episode for the year for the Just in Discussion. So, I think we'll be seeing each other maybe next year as well, and we can unpack more of these topics. Okay, Dr. Chandra, so thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Asana. Thank you for a good job done.